You've given years, decades even, of your life to a company. You've sacrificed late nights, weekends, family dinners, all for the sake of keeping the lights on in someone else's empire. And then one Monday morning, in front of your peers, your so-called leaders look you in the eye and call you nothing more than legacy overhead. Dead weight. Replaceable. Disposable. That's exactly what they called me, before firing me right there in the middle of a stand-up meeting. But here's the part they didn't realize. Every single federal certification keeping their company operational, every license that legally allowed them to open their doors each morning, every piece of paperwork that stood between them and absolute collapse was tied to my name. And when they cut me loose, they unknowingly cut the lifeline to their entire empire. If you've ever been underestimated, humiliated, or tossed aside like you didn't matter, this story is for you. Because today, you'll see what happens when arrogance blinds leaders and karma finds its sharpest blade in the hands of the overlooked. So make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with me until the very end, because this is not just a story of betrayal. It's a story of poetic revenge so devastating, so precise, that it brought an empire to its knees. For over 15 years, I worked at that company. 15 years is long enough to watch interns become directors, long enough to see CEOs come and go, long enough to witness corporate cultures shift like tides. But through all of it, one thing never changed. I was the anchor. Not the flashy type. Not the kind who bragged in meetings or elbowed my way to credit. My role was quiet but essential. I handled compliance, federal certifications, regulatory paperwork, all the licenses that allowed our products to legally exist in the market. To most, that sounded boring. Dry. Invisible work. But anyone in the industry knew, without those certifications, without those signed approvals, without my constant vigilance, the entire operation was a house of cards. And yet, invisibility has a cost. When you're the one in the background, the one who prevents disasters rather than creates breakthroughs, people forget. They forget that stability is value. They forget that quiet competence is the backbone of everything. I felt it more with each passing year. My younger colleagues, especially the ones who came from shiny MBA programs, looked at me like I was dated. Stale. An old model clinging on while the world sped past. Still, I pushed on. Because I believed in loyalty. I believed in giving my all to the company that had once believed in me. I believed, naively, that dedication was its own form of armor. But that illusion shattered on a Monday morning. The meeting room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cologne. It was one of those open-floor conference spaces with glass walls that made you feel like a specimen under observation. Everyone was there, project leads, department heads, even some fresh recruits still buzzing with nervous energy. Our CEO was away on vacation, so the meeting was being run by his golden boy, Ethan. Ethan was the type of executive you could spot from across the building. Perfectly tailored suits, an endless stream of buzzwords, a smile so polished it could blind you. He was ambitious, ruthless, and worst of all, utterly convinced of his own brilliance. He started the stand-up with his usual theatrics, pacing, gesturing, tossing corporate cliches like confetti. But then he turned to me. "Folks," he said, his grin widening, "we need to address something. This company's been carrying some legacy overhead. And it's time to trim the fat." The words sliced through the room. For a second, I thought he meant budgets, maybe some outdated software. But then his eyes locked on mine. He said my name, out loud, in front of everyone. "This is the end of the road." Effective immediately, protagonist is no longer with the company. Laughter, nervous, scattered, rippled around the room. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the words that followed. I had given them 15 years. I had sacrificed my time, my health, my sanity. And in return, public humiliation. A dismissal dressed up as a performance. A spectacle for the interns to whisper about over lunch. I couldn't even form words. My jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. My body was trembling, not just from anger, but from a sense of betrayal so deep it hollowed me out in real time. Ethan's grin never faltered. "We thank you for your service," he added, as if I'd been a soldier dismissed from duty rather than the man whose signatures held the company's foundation together. I walked out of that glass room feeling like I'd been skinned alive. But beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, something darker was stirring. A whisper I couldn't quite silence. They have no idea what they've just done. The day I walked out of that glass-walled room, a hush followed me. I could feel the eyes of my coworkers burning holes in my back. Some of them looked away, pretending to type furiously on their laptops. Others whispered, their mouths covered by coffee mugs. But no one spoke up. No one defended me. That's how corporations work, isn't it? Fear breeds silence. I collected my things from my desk, a framed photo of my kids, a worn leather notebook, a couple of certification binders that I had carried like armor. Every step felt heavier, like I was dragging not just my belongings, but the ghost of who I had been in that office. As I passed by Ethan's glass office, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking like a king surveying his conquered land. He even raised his hand in a mock salute, as if to say, "Good riddance, old man." That smirk carved itself into my memory. Corporate erasure. In the days that followed, the company wasted no time erasing me. My email account was deactivated within hours. My name disappeared from the internal directory like I had never existed. The compliance team, new hires who had shadowed me for barely a month, were suddenly promoted, their titles puffed up to make it look like they could fill my shoes. I heard through the grapevine that Ethan called me a relic during a department-wide call. His words spread like wildfire. He said you were just paperwork. He said compliance is the kind of thing AI can handle now. He called you an anchor, holding the ship back. The more I heard, the more bile rose in my throat. Paperwork? AI? Did Ethan really believe a machine could navigate the labyrinth of federal certifications, the endless back and forth with auditors, the phone calls at 2 a.m. when regulations shifted overnight? But arrogance has a way of rewriting reality. And Ethan was a master storyteller. Ethan saw himself as the future. He wanted sleek, glossy pitches to investors, not binders of legal forms. He wanted innovation, disruption, fast growth. Compliance bored him. It was slow, methodical, full of rules that shackled his dreams of rapid expansion. To him, I wasn't a safeguard. I was ballast, dead weight. And he loved telling people that. A former colleague confided in me over drinks one night. Ethan literally called you legacy overhead in 3 different meetings this week. He's making you an example, like some kind of dinosaur he finally took down. My hands shook around the glass. It wasn't just that he fired me. It was the way he reveled in it. The way he turned my career, my life's work, into a punchline for his rise to power. That was when humiliation turned into rage. The golden boy's reign. Ethan wasn't just arrogant, he was cunning. He positioned himself as the savior of the company, the man who cut costs, who trimmed the fat. My firing became his banner of efficiency. He strutted through the halls, basking in the praise of sycophants who nodded along, desperate to stay in his good graces. He even held a town hall meeting where he bragged, "We don't need outdated processes slowing us down. We're leaner, smarter, faster now." I heard the recording later. My name wasn't mentioned, but I didn't need it to be. The implication was crystal clear. I became the ghost story whispered in corridors, the man who got cut because he couldn't keep up. Except they had no idea. For weeks, I sat at home with my leather notebook open, scribbling down memories, dates, contract clauses. My anger sharpened into focus. I wasn't just fired. I was fired without them understanding the foundation they stood on. You see, years earlier, when the company had been scrambling to meet federal requirements, I had been the one who stepped up. I had studied the regulations, built relationships with auditors, fought tooth and nail to keep us compliant. And in return, the company tied all those certifications to my name. Every renewal, every update, every compliance certificate listed me as the responsible officer. Not the company. Not the board. Me. And hidden in my contract, a clause existed. A clause Ethan never bothered to read. a clause that made me, effectively, the keystone of their legal operations. Terminate me, and all certifications tied to my authority would vanish. I had warned them, years ago, that this setup was risky. The board ignored me, trusting my loyalty. After all, why would I ever leave? Ethan thought he'd gotten rid of deadweight, but what he really did was pull the pin on a grenade. The first cracks. I didn't have to lift a finger at first. The cracks appeared on their own. 2 weeks after my firing, I got a late-night call from a former colleague, panicked, whispering like he was in a war zone. The auditors showed up today. No one could sign off the documents. Ethan tried, but they laughed him out of the room. Said his name isn't on the certification list. I smiled in the dark. Another week later, I heard from someone else. They're scrambling, man. Clients are starting to ask questions. Projects are on hold because no one can clear them legally. Ethan's freaking out. The dominoes were falling. And I hadn't even pushed yet. Ethan's spin. But Ethan wasn't going down without a fight. He tried spinning the crisis as temporary turbulence. He held another town hall talking about transitioning certifications to modern processes. He blamed legacy systems, a thinly veiled jab at me, for the delays. But spin can't replace signatures. And clients don't care about excuses when their million-dollar projects are frozen in limbo. I pictured Ethan's smirk cracking at the edges. I pictured the sweat on his temples as he realized that paperwork he dismissed as outdated was strangling his empire. It was delicious. I could have sat back and watched it all implode. But revenge, true revenge, isn't passive. It's surgical. It's deliberate. It's the satisfaction of not just watching someone trip, but placing the stone in their path yourself. And I knew exactly how to do it. Because Ethan hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated the depth of my foresight. For years, I had documented everything. Every renewal email, every compliance update, every board meeting where my warnings were ignored. My leather notebook was filled with receipts. And now, I was ready to sharpen them into weapons. They taught us in school that decisions are made in the bright glare of logic. But the truth is uglier. The decisions that change lives are often born in the dark, when everything else has been stripped away. The bright parts were gone, my title, my office, my weekends. All that remained was the raw, aching need to be seen as I once was. Necessary, competent, undeniable. The first nights after the auditors walked away, I did nothing but stare at the ceiling. The house was quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My mind replayed Ethan's smirk over and over, until it felt like a soundtrack in my head, taunting, relentless. I could have called a lawyer. I could have run straight into a courtroom and sued them for wrongful termination. But there's a difference between punishment that drags someone through legal mud and punishment that makes them choke on the consequences of their own arrogance. I wanted the latter. I wanted the kind of justice that left no room for PR spin, no room for excuses. I wanted the kind of revenge that felt inevitable, as if the world itself had corrected a crooked scale. That's when the notebook became more than paper. It became a map. I spread that leather journal across my kitchen table and began to flip through years of dates, stamped emails, names of compliance officers, phone logs, signatures. Each page was a filament connecting me to the company in ways they had assumed were inconsequential. Each line was proof that the certifications, those legal lifelines, were not abstract artifacts of bureaucracy. They were living things tied to a named individual, me. An image came to me, not of blowing them up, not of public humiliation, but of surgical extraction. Of removing the company's ability to pretend they could stand on their own without the scaffolding I had built. If they wanted to act like compliance was optional, the system itself would politely disagree. Planning began in small, careful steps. I made a list, tactical, quiet, methodical. 1. Confirm the legal mechanism. I needed to make sure the clause in my contract truly operated the way I remembered. Not to break laws. This wasn't about illegal sabotage, it was about leaning into the legal architecture they designed around me and letting their own structure do the work. 2. Gather witnesses and records. People remember things differently. Memories mutate. Documents don't. My notebook, emails, recorded reminders to the board. Those were proof. If anyone questioned the way certifications were structured, I wanted hard, irrefutable evidence. 3. Prepare a strategic exit. I would not be caught in a courtroom battle for months. Instead, the plan required leverage at the exact moment of their vulnerability, the next audit cycle, when auditors would be on-site and clients would be watching for compliance sign-offs. 4. Secure my future. Revenge without a life afterward is hunger. I needed a job, a foothold, someone who would welcome me with open arms and a nonchalant smile. Not for safety so much as for optics. To be somewhere else when the storm hit, to let them see that their loss had become someone else's gain. I called an old acquaintance, someone at a competitor who knew the market and appreciated the value of an experienced compliance officer. We met for coffee at a greasy spoon that smelled of frying onions and cheap coffee. The fluorescent light hummed above us while I laid out the facts, not melodramatically, just plainly. He listened. I watched him count the seconds the way people do when they are weighing risk and reward. When I finished, he smiled, but not the smug smile Ethan wore. It was a small, private smile, one of admiration. "Do you want back in?" he asked. I could have said no. I could have savored their downfall from the outside. But the plan required me to be in a position of strength, to have the safety of a paycheck and the advantage of working at another firm that could benefit from the fallout. I accepted the offer. It felt like folding a knife and slipping it into my pocket, practical, necessary, cold. Revenge is a slow discipline. There are no fireworks at first. It's patient. It waits while people rearrange their lives around the lie that everything is normal. It watches as a leader grows complacent, as procedures get sloppy, as those in power begin to believe their own PR. I spent the following weeks in a double life. During the day, I learned my new responsibilities at the competitor, new systems, new colleagues, new protocols. At night, I returned to my leather notebook. I copied emails, saved attachments, documented telephone exchanges. Small things that would later string together into a narrative impossible to deny. My greatest weapon turned out to be how careful I'd been for years. Auditors demanded continuity. They wanted to see a named responsible person, their credentials, their contact information. That was the industry's heartbeat. My name threaded through it like a lifeline. I had expected continuity to be a protection for the company. Instead, it became a trap they'd willingly step into. I reached out to a couple of former colleagues, not the ones who'd cheered my firing, but the quiet, competent ones who had seen how things worked behind closed doors. I didn't ask for loyalty. I asked for truth. And truth, unlike loyalty, is contagious. They provided what I needed: corroboration, dates, witness accounts, the names of the exact certifications, and the dates they'd been tied to me. Each confirmation was a small, clean victory. But planning isn't just assembly. It's choreography. I needed a moment, a set of dominoes, aligned precisely so that when the first fell, the rest toppled with a sound so definitive there would be no questioning the cause. That moment would be an audit. Auditors are not dramatic people. They bring clipboards, forms, a kind of bureaucratic patience that can seem boring to the brash. But to a company that relies on certifications, auditors are like weather forecasters. They call storms. I knew when the next full review was scheduled. It was 6 weeks away, enough time to ensure my documentation was airtight, enough time to place people in positions to confirm the facts, enough time to secure a position with my competitor so I could watch from a safe distance. One truth underpinned everything. Ethan wasn't thorough. He had swagger, charm, investors, and an appetite for headlines. He didn't read clause details. He didn't memorize contacts. He believed in optics, not details. And that arrogance was going to be his undoing. There's always a moment when you check yourself, the moral counterbalance. Revenge has to feel proportionate, or else it becomes cruelty. I asked myself the brutal questions. Was I breaking the law? No. Was I setting out to ruin people who had families, mortgages, lives? Not directly. I intended to hold them to the consequences of their own structural choices. They had made a system that depended on a single man's name and then treated that man like garbage. If the law and the documents produced consequences, it would be because they had built them that way. Did I feel anger? Yes. Deep human anger. But beneath that was something cleaner, a desire for balance, for justice, for the world to reflect back the truth of what arrogance can do in the absence of respect. When the moral arithmetic settled, I moved forward. I made copies of everything. I lined up witnesses. I set my career in motion at a new firm that would not hesitate to welcome a man with a track record. And then, when the audit date drew closer, I breathed. Not because I had won, because I had turned chaos into a plan. The morning the auditors arrived, the city felt unusually loud. Sirens in the distance. Trucks backing up. It was the kind of day that makes people hurry without purpose, like the world itself was impatient. I sat alone in my car outside a coffee shop a block from my old office, hands wrapped around a paper cup that had gone lukewarm. My new badge hung from a lanyard around my neck, a small, sharp reminder that I belonged somewhere else now. I watched the building across the street. Glass, steel, the logos that meant nothing to me anymore. Ethan's shadow moved behind the curtains. He was already in motion, practiced, composed, the picture of someone who believed disruption could solve every problem. When the first two auditors walked through the revolving doors, they carried black folders and an air of practiced indifference. They weren't looking for drama. They were looking for signatures, for continuity, for a clear paper trail. Their job was meticulous. Their temperament was not to be rushed. Ethan met them in the lobby with a clipboard and a smile too bright for the situation. He ushered them up to the conference room where the compliance binders used to sit, binders that, by then, had been shuffled into boxes labeled archival. He greeted them with confident phrases about transition and upgrading systems. The auditors nodded politely, jotting things down like metronomes keeping time. I wasn't in the room. I was sipping coffee 2 blocks away. I didn't need to be there to watch the scene unfold. I'd already done what needed doing. The chess pieces were placed, and the first move was coming. When the auditors asked for the name of the responsible compliance officer, an ordinary procedural question, Ethan's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. He flipped through a sheet of paper, then another. He smiled again, then the smile thinned. "We've transitioned that role into a new compliance team," he said, his voice steady. "You'll find their contacts in the binder." The auditor turned a page, scanned the list, and paused. "We need the name of the qualified individual on record. Per federal regulations, there must be an assigned responsible officer. This is not a team responsibility. It must be documented." Ethan's throat worked. That should be in the electronic registry. Let me." He looked at his tablet. He typed. He swore under his breath. The auditors exchanged glances, professionalism warring with curiosity. "Sir," one of them said, "there's a list of named responsible officers linked to these certifications. The agent on the certificate must be verified." Ethan's confident pace faltered. He called IT. He called the legal team. Voices on speakerphones mixed into a white noise of urgency. The auditors remained calm. Their job wasn't to panic companies. It was to diagnose compliance. Outside, in my car, my fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the steering wheel. I could feel my heartbeat in my temples, anticipation and a strange, clinical satisfaction. I wasn't enjoying their panic. I was witnessing the architecture of consequences. They had built this house to code. My name was part of that code. When the auditor asked directly for the contact person listed on the certificate, the legal counsel in the room produced a printout. There was a pause so long you could hear the hum of the building's air conditioning. "No registered responsible officer is listed under the company's current contacts," the counsel admitted, words small and brittle. The auditors made one more request, a point of contact who had authority to sign off on corrective actions. The room grew thin with the sound of swallowed air. Ethan spoke quickly, too quickly. "We're performing an internal transition. Please allow us time to provide a point of contact." The auditors, competent and impersonal, explained the implications. Projects tied to these certifications could not proceed without a named responsible officer. Certain client contracts would be paused until compliance was verified. Some regulatory bodies could issue temporary holds. Their language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was plain. Money stops. Doors close. Back at my old desk, the empty chair sat like an accusation. I had left weeks earlier, but the echoes of my work remained. My phone buzzed, an old colleague, short, frantic. "They're asking for your signature," the text read. "Ethan can't find it. Clients are being put on hold." I drove to the building. Not inside. Not yet. I stood across the street, watching the executives spill into the lobby. Faces tight, eyes darting. I felt no gloating, only the cold clarity of one who had set a trap and now watched the animal reveal itself in its panic. Ethan called for an emergency board meeting that afternoon. They shuffled papers like dancers without choreography. The CEO, who had been on vacation, flew back with the suddenness of someone summoned home by a crisis. He stepped into the room like a man waking into a nightmare. His tan looked artificial under fluorescent lights. He demanded answers. Ethan, who had been the confident young hero, now looked like he was struggling to remember the script. "What do you mean we can't sign?" the CEO barked, voice brittle. "What is missing?" Legal produced the certificates, the audit logs. One by one, the documents were read like indictments. Names appeared, and then the absence of my name hung in the room like a missing tooth. "This is procedural," the legal head said, voice low. "The certifications list a named responsible officer. Without that, certain approvals are invalid. We need to either reassign the certifications formally or halt the projects." Investors started asking questions. Clients got emails. Projects with six-figure invoices froze mid-process. The company's phone began ringing like a landline in a horror movie. Urgent, accusing, relentless. Ethan paced the floor. He tried to spin it as a temporary administrative oversight, then a systems update. Each spin was thinner than the last. The boardroom, which had been filled with nodding heads and polite applause when Ethan announced my firing, now pulsed with a different energy. Fear, incredulity, blame. I sat in my car until dusk, watching their light go down in the windows. The building lit up like a stage where an actor had forgotten his lines. I felt the knot in my chest loosen, just slightly. It wasn't triumph. It was the relief of a plan executed cleanly. But the execution was never meant to be the end. There were more moves to come, legal clarifications to be made, witnesses to be brought forward, strategic reveals to ensure the fall was comprehensive and public. The auditors had opened a door. I intended to watch them walk through it and then quietly close it behind them. As dusk deepened, small news items, industry newsletters, began to mention delays at the company. A client tweeted a cryptic line about compliance hiccups. Nothing definitive yet, but the seed had been planted. Ethan spent the night fielding angry calls. He listened to vendors demanding answers and to internal managers pleading for sign-offs. He promised things he couldn't deliver. His voice, once steady and mocking, was starting to fray. And somewhere between his sleepless calls and their frozen projects, the company's golden narrative started to unravel. When the CEO returned from his tropical escape, the office no longer hummed with confidence. The fluorescent lights felt harsher, the hallways emptier. Employees avoided eye contact, whispering in the corners like schoolchildren caught in a scandal. The air smelled of stale coffee and panic. The CEO's first words to the board weren't greetings or questions. They were accusations. What the hell happened while I was gone? Ethan, the golden boy, had always been the CEO's prize. The prodigy who spoke in smooth soundbites, the young visionary who seemed to promise endless growth. Now he stood at the far end of the table, his hair disheveled, tie loosened, posture bent as if the weight of the company's failure was pressing down on his spine. He launched into excuses. It's a transition issue. Legacy processes. The auditors are being inflexible. But the CEO cut him off. Legacy processes? You said you fixed legacy problems. You fired the man who ran compliance. You promised me continuity. And now I come back to find operations frozen, clients walking, and auditors writing warnings. The board murmured agreement. Some glared. Others shook their heads. Ethan's mask was cracking in real time. The fallout wasn't confined to the boardroom. Clients began pulling contracts. not just pausing projects, pulling them entirely. They didn't care about Ethan's jargon. They cared about risk. And no client wanted to be attached to a company whose compliance was under federal scrutiny. One client's letter leaked online. It was clinical, brutal. Given the regulatory deficiencies uncovered in your recent audit, we are terminating our agreement effective immediately. The letter spread through LinkedIn like wildfire. Industry insiders whispered, then shouted. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about legacy overhead or innovative transitions. It was about a company too arrogant to respect compliance. Reporters sniffed blood. Small blogs ran headlines first, then bigger outlets joined in. Audit freeze halts growth at rising tech firm. Stockholders panicked. Investors sent curt emails demanding explanations. And Ethan? He drowned in it. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening. A closed-door emergency meeting. Voices raised, then muffled silence. When the doors opened, Ethan emerged pale, sweat beading at his temples. He no longer looked like the golden boy. He looked like a man stripped bare, like someone who had been told he was not the savior but the scapegoat. The CEO followed behind, his jaw set like stone. He stopped in front of Ethan, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. You wanted to be the future? Congratulations. You're now the example of everything this company will never be again. And with that, Ethan was demoted, stripped of authority, sidelined to a meaningless role where his only job was damage control no one believed he could manage. The board didn't just remove his power, they gutted his reputation. The man who once strutted through the office with a smirk now slunk from meeting to meeting, whispers following him like shadows. I didn't need to stand in the boardroom to savor the moment. I had colleagues, friends, contacts who fed me updates. Every detail was more satisfying than the last. When Ethan's demotion hit the internal memo system, someone sent me a screenshot. My eyes lingered on the lines. Effective immediately, Ethan, last name, will no longer oversee compliance, client relations, or regulatory operations. The man who once mocked me publicly, who laughed as he called me legacy overhead, had been publicly stripped of every responsibility that gave him power. I sat at my new desk, at my competitor's office, reading the memo with a calm, steady heartbeat. No fireworks, no shouting, just a quiet exhale, like closing the final page of a book I had written in invisible ink. But the downfall didn't stop with Ethan. The CEO himself faced backlash. Investors wanted to know why the company's critical licenses had been tied to one man, and why that man had been discarded without a succession plan. His vacation became a punchline in industry circles, gone fishing while the house burned down. He tried to reframe the narrative, issuing statements about structural oversights and new compliance initiatives. But the damage was done. Trust, once broken, doesn't return easily. Their stock plummeted. Their competitors, my new employer included, snapped up clients who had once been loyal to them. The empire they'd built on arrogance and swagger crumbled in weeks. And me? I thrived. My new role at their top competitor came with better pay, better respect, and most importantly, validation. Every time a client moved their contract over to my new firm, it felt like another stitch in the wound they had carved into me. But here's the truth. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about career advancement. It was about being seen, about reminding them and reminding myself that competence matters, that loyalty matters, that the quiet, steady work they mocked as legacy was in fact the very heart of their survival. I didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. Their collapse was proof enough. The last time I saw Ethan was months later at an industry conference. He wasn't the man he had been. No tailored suit this time, just a wrinkled blazer, circles under his eyes, and a forced smile that trembled at the edges. He stood alone at the bar, nursing a drink like it was the only friend he had left. When our eyes met across the room, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, shame, maybe even fear. He quickly looked away, pretending to scroll on his phone. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. My presence alone was enough. Revenge rarely feels like a Hollywood explosion. It's quieter. It's the release of pressure in your chest, the deep satisfaction of watching balance restored. As I walked out of that conference, I realized something. I wasn't carrying the weight of their betrayal anymore. I wasn't the humiliated man who walked out of that glass-walled meeting room, trembling and hollow. I was the man who survived it, outmaneuvered it, and turned their arrogance into their undoing.
And that was enough.
The funny thing about revenge is that when it's done right, it doesn't consume you. For a while, after I walked out of that office with my box of belongings, I thought the humiliation would haunt me forever. I thought I'd spend the rest of my career being that guy, the one fired in a Monday stand-up, discarded like a broken tool, labeled legacy overhead. But here's what I've learned. Humiliation is temporary. Competence endures. When they mocked me, they weren't just insulting me. They were insulting decades of accumulated knowledge, hard-won expertise, the very backbone of their operations. They thought they could strip that away and replace it with buzzwords and bravado. But arrogance blinds. And arrogance always trips over its own feet. What happened to me isn't unique. Almost everyone listening to this story has felt the sting of being underestimated. Maybe you were the quiet one in class who knew the answer but was ignored. Maybe you worked tirelessly while someone else took the credit. Maybe a boss, a friend, or even a family member treated your loyalty like a burden instead of a gift. That pain, the knot in your stomach, the heat rising to your face, the voice in your head asking, "Do they really think so little of me?" It's universal. And so is the longing for balance, for justice. We crave that moment when the scales tip back, when the cruel word is silenced, when the smug smile falters, when the one who laughed at us realizes they miscalculated. That's why this story resonates. Not because of federal clauses or audit freezes, but because it's about something deeper, the hunger for dignity. Revenge in real life doesn't come with cinematic fireworks. It doesn't always look like shouting matches or public scenes. More often, it looks like this. The arrogant man who thought he owned the room now can't look you in the eye. The company that dismissed you now stumbles because they cut out their foundation. The people who mocked your value now whisper about their own mistakes. It's not about destroying them. It's about restoring you. That's what karma is. It's not fire from the sky. It's the natural weight of consequences. Looking back, I don't regret a single step. Not the years I spent building those certifications, not the quiet patience I had while they gloated, not even the humiliation of being escorted out. Because every piece of it led to the payoff. Every moment of silence, every clenched jaw, every long night questioning myself, it all built toward the day the balance was restored. And now, when I walk into my new office, when I meet new colleagues, when I see respect in their eyes instead of dismissal, I feel lighter, freer. They thought they ended me. In reality, they handed me the pen to write a better chapter. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Never confuse being quiet with being weak. Never confuse patience with passivity. Never confuse loyalty with dependency. The people who underestimate you are often building their own downfall, brick by brick. All you have to do is stand firm, hold on to your worth, and let time do its work. When the collapse comes, and it always comes, it won't be your shouting that topples them. It'll be their arrogance. And you'll be standing, steady and vindicated, as the dust settles. So, let me ask you, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen in real life? Was it a coworker finally getting caught after years of stealing credit? A bully exposed for what they really were? Or maybe something quieter, someone underestimating you, only to watch you succeed where they failed? Share your story in the comments. Because stories like these remind us that karma never forgets, and justice has a way of finding its mark. If this tale hit home for you, smash that like button, subscribe, and join us again for more true stories of betrayal, justice, and revenge served cold. Because sometimes the sweetest victory isn't in shouting your triumph. It's in standing tall, calm, and silent, while your enemies choke on the consequences of their own arrogance. And as I close this chapter, I'll leave you with this thought. They called me legacy overhead. But in the end, I was the only thing holding them up. And when they cut me loose, they didn't just end me, they ended themselves. That was my revenge. Fade to silence.